All right, so now that we've looked at the social construction of race and its history throughout the United States in the conceptualization of racism, let's start thinking like a sociologist now about this topic. How might this historical oppression affect people of color's opportunities to succeed today? Even though, slavery's been abolished, we've had the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s that made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. How and why might racism still negatively affect people in our society today? Well, let's think back to last week when we talked about social class and this idea of the American dream, right? If you remember back to last week, we discussed how the social class that we are born into will likely continue to be our social class for at least the several first decades of our lives, right? We can't control our own amount of wealth when we're young, and so the social class we're born into is likely going to affect our ability to achieve upward social mobility in the future. So how does this reality challenge the idea of the American dream? Do all Americans really have an equal likelihood or an equal opportunity to quote unquote pull themselves up by the bootstraps and overcome the odds, right? Think back to the very first week of class when we watched that privilege walk video, right? Where people took steps forwards or backwards based off of different privileges that they had or had not did not have access to, right? We can apply that exact same idea, that exact same premise to racial oppression in the United States, and to think about how a history of being racially oppressed would affect your likelihood of achieving success or achieving upward social mobility in society today. All right. So I'm, again, very visual person. Let's think of this as a 100-yard race. All right. Maybe this end zone down here is some goal that a person is trying to achieve, whether it's getting into a certain school, securing a certain job, maybe attaining a certain amount of wealth, etc. All right. Now, ideologically, we like to believe this premise in the United States that everyone is created equal, right? That's, something that our nation is supposedly built upon, this premise that everyone is created equal and has equal opportunities. However, let's consider the historical applications of being a person of color here in the United States, all right? So I'm going to ask a series of questions, and let's imagine these two racers here. We have one who appears to be white, one who appears to be black, and we're going to ask them to move 10 yards ahead if their great-grandparents' skin color did not affect their ability to do certain things. So this first question I'll pose is, move 10 yards ahead if your great-grandparents' skin color did not affect your ability to get an education. Well, white people can move ahead on that. African Americans cannot. Next, if their color of their skin did not affect their ability to hold a paying job. Again, something that white people have never been burdened with in our society. If the color of your skin did not affect their ability to take public transportation to get places. Again, nothing that a white person has ever had to be concerned about because of the color of their skin in our society. Next thing, to take out a loan. If the color of your skin has never affected your ability to take out a loan, move 10 yards ahead. Again, another thing that white people have never had to deal with that people of color do. Owning property, another aspect. Being able to vote. Color of skin's never affected a white person's ability to vote in United States history, to run for political office, to actually be a policymaker that could influence change at the structural level. Again, white people never had to worry about that. To access healthcare, to be able to even go to a doctor's office or a credible doctor, a licensed doctor, to access that kind of care. Not something white people have ever had to worry about because of the color of their skin in the United States. Or simply even being able to go for a walk without fear of being lynched. Again, not something at the structural level that white people have ever had to be concerned with. All right? So who stands a better chance at reaching this goal? All things we considered here now, right? If I had my little blowhorn to start this race, who do we expect is going to have an easier time reaching this goal? Okay? Obvious answer would be the white person. They've had several advantages in their lifetime that were unearned. They were unearned benefits. That doesn't mean that they didn't work hard for what they do have. That doesn't mean that they didn't experience oppression or inequality in other sectors of their life. But what it means is that white people in the United States do not have a history of oppression because of the color of their skin. The color of their skin was never a factor that structurally disadvantaged them from achieving or pursuing their goals. So when we tell people to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, that the American dream is attainable to everyone, if you only work hard enough, you can achieve anything, this visual paints a pretty clear picture for us that not everyone has equal opportunity. Not everyone is able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps because some people are facing barrier after barrier after barrier. Some people don't have a history of wealth. You know, if people of color, African Americans, weren't allowed to actually own property and accrue wealth for about the last 100 years of our history, whereas white people have been able to do that since the United States was established, right? Now think about that. Think about how generation from generation passes on wealth, passes on property, homesteads, lands, money to future generations. White people are at a systemic advantage because they have not been historically oppressed the way people of color have been in the United States. And like I said, this doesn't mean that white people don't work hard. It doesn't mean that white people don't experience other forms of oppression. White people might experience social class inequality, right? Some white people are poor as dirt, and so they experience inequality and oppression because they are a minority group in terms of socioeconomic status. But that doesn't take away the advantages that people get because they're white, right? So we'll come back to this idea later, and hopefully this is starting to sink in and make a little more sense here. But moving forward now, we're going to start talking more directly about these implications of the history of race and racism in the United States and how it's contributed to racial inequality currently in the US. So let's identify a few terms here. You should be familiar from the readings this week. The first that we should approach is a minority group. So when we're talking about a minority group from a sociological perspective, we're talking about any category or grouping of people who are distinguished by either a physical or a cultural difference that a society sets apart and subordinates, which means that they treat it as less than. So a minority group is any group of people in society that society has decided is less than or should be marginalized in comparison to some other group, okay? So some examples of minority groups currently in the US would be any non-white race is a minority group, women, members of the LGBT plus community, disabled people. All of these would be examples of minority groups, groups of people that are set aside or are distinguished by some physical or cultural difference and are subordinated. So for every minority group, there is an opposite dominant group. So dominant groups are those that hold power in society. So for example, if non-white races are minority groups, then white people would be a dominant group, as are men, heterosexuals, able-bodied people, etc. So this should be sounding kind of familiar because we talked about this in similar but different terms in the very first week of the semester when we introduced this idea of privileged groups and marginalized groups, right? So another way to think of this is that a minority group is basically a synonym for a marginalized group, and a dominant group in society is a synonym for a privileged group, right? They essentially refer to the same thing. Being a minority group does not necessarily mean that there are fewer people in that group. So when people hear the word minority group, they might automatically associate that with being fewer in number, and that's not necessarily the case. For example, women are a minority group in the United States despite comprising 51% of the population. So while that's a slight majority, women do technically have the numerical majority in the United States, but due to the social construction of gender, which we'll be talking about in coming weeks, and our society's patriarchal foundations, which privilege men and masculinity, women are still a minority group in the United States today. Another example of this is that while they represented a much smaller proportion of South Africa's population, the dominant group of white people maintained a system of apartheid that racially segregated and discriminated against Black South Africans for many years. Okay. Also interesting to note that while white non-Hispanic people still make up about 60% of the US population, in the very near future, white people will no longer be the racial majority in the United States, but they will still likely be the dominant group because they will still have an abundance of power and privilege over racial minorities in the US. Interestingly, currently in the US, 5 states, including Texas, are already majority-minority states, meaning that the majority of people living in these states are actually people of color or people of races or ethnicities that are not white in nature. So a few other terms that are really important to our sociological discussion of racial inequality here. First is stereotypes, which are oversimplified generalizations about groups of people. Stereotypes can be phrased as positive things, saying something like women are better caregivers than men, or they can also be negative, things saying stereotypes such as saying poor people are lazy, and they can be based off of virtually any characteristic. I'm sure you all have heard many, many stereotypes based off of race, based off of gender, sexualities, ages, socioeconomic status, etc. Stereotypes, as the definition says, are oversimplified generalizations about groups of people. They are generalizations, meaning they are not grounded in science. They are not grounded in fact. They do not necessarily need to be true in order for society to buy into them and to perpetuate them, which is what is so dangerous and harmful about stereotypes in our society today, is that oftentimes 1 or 2 incidences will be blown way out of proportion and used to stereotype an entire group of people. And we see this very frequently with racial stereotypes. You might see one person of color be negatively labeled as being a criminal for a certain act that they've committed, and that will get blown way out of proportion in the media. And because the majority of adults rely on media sources rather than scientific sources to establish their own beliefs and values, stereotypes can be very, very harmful to our society. Again, they are not grounded in fact. Sometimes stereotypes may reflect reality. They may reflect what's actually happening or patterns of human behavior, but that is not always the case. And that is, again, why they are so, so harmful to our society, because people are looking for a quick and easy way to get their information, and the quick and easiest way to do that is to scroll through news headlines on social media or on their computer, or to flip on the news and to see and ingest the images and the stories that they're being told without thinking about them critically, or without fact-checking, without justifying the claims that are being made by the headlines and looking into the actual scientific evidence that either supports or defutes the claims that are being made. And that's why stereotypes are so damn harmful to our society today. They are oversimplifications that are generalized way out of proportion without being grounded in science. So stereotypes contribute to prejudice. And a prejudice is a biased thought or a prejudgment that is based on a flawed assumption or a stereotype about a group of people. It is important to note that prejudice is a learned behavior. Nobody is born being a bigot. Nobody is born being racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic or Islamophobic. Those are learned behaviors. Those are learned attitudes and beliefs, and you learned them through agents of socialization. Depending on your upbringing, where you're from, what agents of socialization you were exposed to, including your education, your family, the media that you watched and consumed as a child, etc. All of those agents of socialization influence the way you think and view the world, and they inevitably infused all of us with a level of prejudice about certain groups, specifically groups that we probably are not exposed to or interact with in our own lives, maybe groups of people who our only exposure to was seeing them through the media, right? For example, I grew up in North Dakota, in a very small town in North Dakota, where there were only white people around me. My only exposure to people of color was what I saw being portrayed in the media. And as we'll talk about later, the media does an awful job disproportionately displaying people of color in a negative light in comparison to white people. So that contributes to this nationwide prejudice and racial bias that we cannot escape as members of the society that we live in. Now, prejudice leads to discrimination, which is a prejudiced action against an individual or a group of people. So when you act on the prejudice, that is when discrimination occurs in society.